Okay, Marvin, take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Beth, and great to be on a program with you, Jill. And your book sounds terrific, just terrific. A wonderful immersion in Russia. This book, A Different Russia, is my 18th, and I was joking before when I said, what does an old man do? What does an old retired journalist do? You think back to the most exciting times that you had as a journalist, and I was blessed to have had extraordinary opportunities to cover some of the large moments between the US and the USSR during the Cold War. And Jill, you talked about getting involved in the Cold War, and that was an extraordinary time. I think that people today do not quite grasp that a lot of people during the Cold War in the 1950s, 1960s, these dark days of the Cold War, you did not know at that time whether the crisis on Berlin would lead to a nuclear war, crisis on Cuba would lead to a nuclear war. And for a journalist, I can tell you flat out, it was an incredibly exciting story. And I put it into 3 memoirs. The third is the one I'm talking about today, A Different Russia. It takes place in the period from January 1961 until the fall in 1963. It was a fantastic moment because it started with Kennedy coming into office. Kennedy puts out the word, yeah, under certain circumstances, I'd like to meet Khrushchev. I'd like to talk to him, see whether we can do something together. Khrushchev, unashamedly, was putting out the word through journalists, through the embassy people. I'm very interested in meeting and having a summit meeting with this new president. Khrushchev had met Kennedy in August 1959 when Khrushchev visited the United States. He was up on Capitol Hill. He shook hands with Kennedy. He always had in his mind, very handsome young man, but very young. What's he doing with that kind of senatorial responsibility? Well, he is now president of the United States, still very young. And they want to meet, but there are obstacles. First, there is the murder of Patrice Lumumba, who was Khrushchev's man in the Congo. And Khrushchev felt that that was a nasty thing that the colonialists did. I've always keep that in my mind. What he downplayed was the American role in the murder of Patrice Lumumba. And a couple of months after that, there was the deep disappointment for the United States of what happened in Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. And in Khrushchev's mind at that time, he couldn't figure out, and we were told this quite frankly by a number of his people, he couldn't figure out how an American president would allow himself to get so trapped that he would be embarrassed that his people were wiped out by Castro, who was waiting for them. Big humiliation. Khrushchev kind of put that in his hip pocket. And they did work out the summit meeting, the only time they actually met, in Vienna, June 2nd and 3rd, or 3rd and 4th of 1961. I've covered quite a few of the summits, and this one was a highlight because there was so much advanced expectation that great things were going to happen. Well, what happened, in fact, was that after 2 days of talking, Khrushchev left believing that Kennedy could be taken to the cleaners. I say that because on that Sunday night, I bumped into someone a Russian I knew from Moscow, who was an interpreter and worked with Khrushchev. And I said, give me a couple of sentences on what was Khrushchev's vision of Kennedy. And he said, I'll tell you in 3 words. Very young. I said, well, that's obvious. What else? Highly inexperienced. He doesn't quite know what he's saying. And weak. He's reflecting weakness. And this was something that really stuck in my mind because Khrushchev was a very emotional Russian leader. I had quite a few occasions actually to talk to him. And those conversations went from American basketball, believe it or not, to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Khrushchev had an instinct about people. In this sense, perhaps he's a little bit like Trump. I don't know that he read a great deal, but he depended on him, on his instincts. And he felt that with Kennedy, maybe he could work out a deal, but more than likely, he's going to try to take advantage of that. And in the spring of 1962, when he was at a meeting in Bulgaria and took a walk with his defense minister along the beach, and Malinowski pointed to the water and he said, across the Black Sea, he said, the Americans have missiles. We knew about that, but we know now that they're operational. They're pointed at the Soviet Union. Khrushchev got one of his emotional moments, began to scream, and then he yelled out, we're going to put a hedgehog in Uncle Sam's pants, and he's going to feel very unhappy. And that was the moment that the Cuban Missile Crisis hatched. He was going to do something, not quite knowing what. Within the next month, he had a series of, quote, big secret meetings with his people. Cuba was going to be where it was going to happen. And remarkably, over the next 6 months, 5 months, he moved 50,000 Soviet troops, missiles, we know post facto, some of them equipped with nuclear warheads, through the Dardanelles, across the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic Ocean. The United States knew nothing. When the Russians want to keep a secret, they really can keep a secret. And it was only to the end of August that through American senators talking about word that they got from Cuban exiles, that word began to peek out in Washington, not Moscow, in Washington, that something big was going on. But in this book, what I try very hard to do was to explain, or to give you a picture of what it was like in Moscow at that time, in the build-up to the Cuban crisis. I thought reading the press, talking to as many Russians, etc., I would always go out to the Russian marketplace on the outskirts of Moscow, not to buy food necessarily, but just to talk to Russians and find out a little bit what was on their minds. Because sometimes you can get trapped reading Pravda into thinking that that's necessarily what the Russian people are thinking, sometimes not at all. And the Russians kept on saying to me, ordinary folks, Berlin, that is where we might have won. Berlin, don't push us too hard on Berlin, which was then a divided city, a residue of what had been left over from World War II. On, I believe, October 22nd, we get word through the American embassy in Moscow, the president is going to be making a big speech. We're going to set it up so that you guys can hear it. And through CBS, we worked out a deal where I could hear the president's speech and then comment from Moscow what I thought about it. And that was a stunner, because what the president said in effect was, Russia, stop a quarantine of Cuba. If you don't get your stuff out, we are going to consider an attack upon us as justification for an attack on you. And suddenly in Moscow, what had been sensed suddenly materialized. We realized we were in the middle of something very serious. And each day became an additional impetus of crisis. It kept flowering. On Tuesday, the following day, Khrushchev appears at the Bolshoi Theater because an American opera star is performing Boris Godunov. Now think about this. The president has just announced, in effect, whoops, watch it, kids, danger, real danger. Khrushchev goes to an American opera star's performance. I was saying to myself, this guy is seeking a way out. But how do you get out? Since he's the one who put the missiles in. On Wednesday, Khrushchev meets with an American businessman and spends 2 hours with him, as if he's got nothing else in the world to do. What to think about it? 2 hours with him, making what point? Let us talk. We can always get out of a problem. Talk. Thursday, the UN Deputy Secretary General comes in with an absurd proposal. Let's take 3 weeks and we'll have a summit meeting that will last 3 weeks and we'll get rid of the crisis in that way. It was absurd. Kennedy said, get your missiles out. Got nowhere. Friday, the president receives a letter from Khrushchev that was Khrushchev at his most emotional. In effect, warning, don't mess with us because we are very powerful. We can do all kinds of things to you. And you are the people who are going to have to back off on Berlin. I can tell you that the people at the embassy in Moscow, the West German embassy, very clued in. Everyone was absolutely terrified that maybe this was going to get out of hand. On Saturday, another letter from Khrushchev, totally different. Totally different. Let's find a way out of this. Sunday, the big day, October 29th, I start by going off to the marketplace outside of Moscow. And again, the theme that I heard was very specific. Cuba, forget about it. It's not important. Who cares about it? Berlin, watch Berlin. There, we're going to fight you, but we have no interest in fighting you on. This is ordinary stuff from ordinary people. And what you're talking about is a nuclear war possibility. I go back to the office, get my stuff, go down to Central Telegraph. And my first broadcast, given the time difference, was at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, Moscow time. I bump into a Russian Moscow radio guy whom I knew for many years. And I thought I'd get a nice friendly response from him. And I say, what's up? And he doesn't want to answer me. I don't take offense. I sort of back off. He then talks to the woman behind the desk. And I overheard him say, Yuri, that's the Russian name, and I'm beginning to think, maybe he's thinking about the Yuri who does all of the famous broadcasts, who does something only of major significance on Moscow radio. And I set up, and he tells me, listen to the 5 o'clock broadcast on Moscow radio. I listened in at 5 o'clock. We set up 2 lines to New York. Excuse my throat. 2 lines to New York. One is a line for me if I had anything to say. The other, they're listening to Moscow radio, and I'm listening to this man whose last name at the moment, forgive me, this is really old age.
It's a Leviton.
Levitan. He is speaking. I know the voice, I know the guy, and I'm saying to myself, this is either a proclamation of war or the other side, some form of peace. And in the third sentence, he says, two words jump out at him. One is crate, like crate in, put stuff in a crate, bundle it up. And the other was remove. And I screamed out on my line, he has just caved. And Blair Clark, my boss at the other end, says, can we go with that? I said, let me listen another sentence or two. Then it was clear that Khrushchev had said he's going to pull out of Cuba. What a story and what a moment in history. And that you lived through it, believe me, is an incredibly exciting thing to be able to go back and resurrect moments like that. The very end of the book, I mentioned that they did reach an agreement, the first atmospheric nuclear test ban agreement. If it was all left to Khrushchev, I think we might have seen better times. But Khrushchev did something that they called a harebrained scheme, and it surely was, and he almost got the world into a nuclear war, but he had the guts to acknowledge the mistake, and he pulled out. And in conclusion, I would just say, wrapping it up with a contemporary moment, I truly believe that if Putin had been the Soviet leader at that time, in October 1962, he would not have had the guts to acknowledge a huge personal and political blunder, which is what Khrushchev did, and we'd have had a war. Whether it would have led to a nuclear exchange, who knows, but a war which we could all have done without and ultimately did. And that was sort of the wrap up of the book. But I'd love to hear, questions and comments, whatever. Great fun. Thank you.